reflect some of the parenting issues.
Again, as Marie said, I think that movies tell us about our options to some extent. They tell us what may be happening in the community, because what goes on in that movie is often reflective of what's happening out in society. I think rarely are movies trailblazers, at least not successful movies, that come up with something that no one's ever heard of or thought of, and everyone rushes to do it. And so I think what we saw in Kramer versus Kramer was probably already happening, but it led more people to say, gee, fathers can be parents too, that it doesn't have to be just moms, you know, are the parents.
One of the interesting things, by the way, when we, in anticipation of doing the show, we watched Kramer versus Kramer again, and now with the DVDs you can get to see some of the background. And one of the things we learned, which I never knew before, was that Dustin Hoffman, who played the father in Kramer versus Kramer, was actually going through his own divorce at the time, so that there was a little bit of art imitating life and life imitating art in that situation. There was a scene, though, I thought was in Kramer versus Kramer, which is also interesting, where he sort of he loses custody, and you see him explaining why the judge did what he did, and also the questions, the scenes on the stand, I thought were very, very powerful, also showing how both of them were very much influenced by the effect of that one. How about the TV? We're talking mostly about movies, but I think television, like Father Knows Best and Bachelor Father and some of those TV shows. Marie, I don't know if you're old enough to remember some of those, but that presented a very different view of, it seems to me, of parenting, single parenting in those situations.
I need to go back to the Kramer versus Kramer when he lost custody, because sometimes I think that type of television program or movie can create anxiety that is really not reflective of the modern situation.
Let me show you what you mean by that.
People don't have custody very often anymore. They have shared parenting time, and they both continue to parent their children.
Actually, do you use custody, or you use the word custody, or
no,
you use,
what do you use? Because in Arizona, that's not the word that's in the statute. And it's called a co-parenting plan. And it's virtually unheard of for somebody to lose the opportunity to parent and be with their child. It's about creating a plan. And that's what we do as mediators. We develop a plan so that both parents can see their children. Sometimes the movies create a false fear, I think.
But I think it's a very prevalent fear. I think there are certain fears in divorce, and for women, what I hear all the time is this fear of becoming a bag lady, that somehow there will not be enough money to survive. And for men, I won't see my children. And I think it does come, you know, from that rare situation that we all hear about where that's actually happened to someone in court, but we never know the reasons because we weren't there. And it occasionally comes from movies that told us that there was a predisposition among judges for giving mothers custody of their children. And I still hear men worried about that. And it's one of those urban legends, I think, at this point.
I think it does reinforce the urban legends. I always come back to the Chinatown movie, where in the beginning scenes, and I guess in Intolerable Cruelty also, where they hired detectives to get incriminating photographs of the other spouse. And I don't know if you've seen that in your practice, Maria. I can't remember seeing it too often in mine, but it seems to me people still think about that in terms of...
The beauty of Arizona is it's a no-fault state. So, you know, incriminating photos may make you feel bad, but they're not usually relevant to whether you could get divorced or not.
Even if that's the case, Maria, do you find that people do not, even, we're talking about the reality of what the law is, but people still have, once again, come into a case, it seems to me, given what they've seen in movies, what they've talked to their friends, and want to do other things. We talked about the lady who wanted the alimony. So, I mean, do you still find that you have to deal with that?
I think there's some people who have expectations based on whatever their cultural norm is that aren't probably realistic. But most people actually, I think, have a fairly realistic perspective about what's going to happen. Certainly the fear that Mary's talking about, I completely agree. I would be scared too. It's scary.
I think what's also sometimes contributing to people having expectations that are unrelated to reality is that divorce law really is state-by-state law, which is kind of contrary to what anyone thinks.
Right.
And so people will hear about what's happened to their friend in Texas and will assume the same thing would happen to them in Arizona and become very frightened or, cocky because they think, oh, this, is the way it went there, so it'll happen here. And so it would, I think, be a big relief to people if there were some kinds of national divorce laws, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon. But what happens here really is going to be so different than what happens in New York or in Texas or wherever.
Yeah, I often think the case I had was once again in 2 different jurisdictions, and there was about a $25 million asset case, and depending on which jurisdiction you brought the case in, because it was premarital assets or not, it made a difference of whether $15 million was on the table or not on the table. So the jurisdiction does that. But it'd be interesting if we ever did go into a national divorce thing, but I don't see it happening in the near future either. We've been talking a lot about movies and television, not that one, but it seems to me that if you look at some of the statistics, that divorce really started peaking in maximum divorces in the late, maybe in the early 70s, and then it's gone down a little bit since then. But any sense of why perhaps the divorce rate peaked at that point and then has gone down since then? What cultural factors have potentially influenced that?
Well, I think both the change to no-fault divorce and women's economic opportunities, as I said before, probably contributed to the increased divorce rate. I don't know what else would have led to such a dramatic shift, because I don't think anyone really gets divorced because they think it's going to be a great idea. I think people still feel stigmatized by divorce. I think they still feel like failures when they divorce. So I think people make that choice only when they have to. And I think what probably led to the change was economic empowerment and no-fault divorce, because no-fault divorce meant that it was easier.
I'm not sure everybody understands what no-fault versus fault divorce is. Maybe you can give us a quick explanation of that so people understand what that means. Marie, you sort of alluded to it earlier on. Can you do that?
Well, in Arizona, if one of the parties wants to get divorced and the other doesn't, they're getting divorced.
That is the case, now, but I guess there was a point
but
where...
you don't have to prove anything bad happened to the court in order for them to allow you to get divorced. All you have to say is that your marriage is irretrievably broken and that there's no prospect of reconciliation. And it doesn't matter whether the other person ever did a bad thing or not.
And if there wasn't no fault, what would there be?
I have never practiced when there's no fault, but apparently there used to be a system where you proved to the court a reason for obtaining a divorce, such as adultery, or maybe it involved dissipation of community assets, or some reason that the judge would allow you to get divorced.
I have to tell you my favorite intolerable cruelty story, which Mary has heard many, many times, because I started practicing just at that point where we were switching from fault to no fault, and you had to show intolerable cruelty, and you had to show some physical manifestation of intolerable cruelty. And very often people would say that they couldn't sleep, or they're putting weight on it and losing weight. I was in court this day, totally politically incorrect result in this case, and